circa 2650 BCE, the Saqqara necropolis. The very air is a choking storm of fine white limestone dust, a ghostly shroud that clings to the skin and grates between the teeth. The sun is a merciless hammer of brass in a turquoise sky, beating down upon the scarred backs of tens of thousands of men who move as one, a single groaning organism of sweat and muscle. The sound is an inhuman symphony, a constant deafening roar composed of 1,000 distinct tortures, the rhythmic, percussive clang of copper chisels against stone, the agonizing shriek of massive limestone blocks being dragged on wooden sledges over wetted earth, the sharp cracks of foremen's whips, and the guttural chants of laborers heaving ropes thick as a man's thigh. This is not a construction site. It is a battleground, a war waged against gravity itself. And rising from the center of this controlled chaos, shimmering in the heat haze, is the prize, a structure so alien, so utterly without precedent, that it seems to defy not only the landscape but logic itself. It is not the squat, flat-topped mud brick box of a mastaba, the tomb of every king that has gone before. It is something new, something that claws at the sky. 6 tiers of gleaming Tura limestone, a colossal staircase of stone climbing 204 feet high, a man-made mountain in a land of sand and river. Its sheer geometric precision is an insult to the chaos of the desert that surrounds it. This is the culmination of a 30-year vision, a project that has consumed the wealth of a kingdom and the lives of a generation. Standing apart from the swarm, on a low rise, a lone figure watches, his robes whipping in the hot wind. We cannot know his face, but we can feel the intensity of his gaze. He is not a king, for he wears no crown. He is not a slave, for he is bowed by no labor. He is the mind that conceived this impossible form, the will that harnessed this human tempest. His name is Imhotep. He sees not just a tomb, but a resurrection machine, a stone prayer so powerful it will force the gods to take notice. While nascent empires in Mesopotamia build with transient mud, while tribes in Europe erect crude stone circles, he has marshaled a nation to build a stairway to the stars for his king. To understand this man, the first man in history to have his name recorded in stone alongside his pharaohs, we must understand the paradox he embodies. For while this pyramid would make his king immortal, it was Imhotep himself, a man of no royal blood, who would achieve the ultimate apotheosis and become a god. This is the narrative of him, Imhotep, the one who comes in peace. It is the saga of the first true polymath in human history, a man who was simultaneously the chief minister to his king, the nation's chief physician, its high priest, and its master architect. But beyond the litany of his titles lies the central, explosive mystery of his existence, a question that unravels the very fabric of the ancient world's most rigid society. How did a man, likely a commoner, ascend so high in the court of a divine pharaoh that his name was carved into the base of the king's own statue, an unprecedented honor? More profoundly, how did his legacy, 2,000 years after his death, mutate from that of a brilliant mortal into that of a full-fledged god of medicine, worshipped in his own temples, to whom desperate Egyptians and later Greeks would pray for healing? This is the core dramatic paradox, the transformation of a man of logic, of stone and measure, of architectural blueprints and administrative decrees, into a figure of pure myth, a divine healer whose power was magical and supernatural. It poses the ultimate question: what did this man do? What did he build? And what did he know that allowed him to shatter the immutable barrier that separated the human from the divine? Was it merely the sheer, overwhelming scale of his genius that echoed through the millennia? Or was his deification a symptom of a deeper cultural need, a perfect storm of history, politics, and faith that required a mortal to become a god? To answer this, we must journey back to the world that birthed him, a world still taking its first steps out of the prehistoric mist, a young kingdom dreaming of an eternity it had not yet learned how to build. We must explore how this singular mind not only erected the first colossal stone building on Earth, but also constructed a new idea of legacy, an immortality of wisdom and influence so potent that it would ultimately grant him a throne among the gods themselves. To understand the revolution that was Imhotep, we must first return to the world of the third dynasty of Egypt, a kingdom still breathing the damp air of its own creation. This was not yet the monolithic, eternal empire of Tutankhamun or Ramesses the Great. This was a fragile state, forged only a few centuries prior from the violent unification of the two lands, the lush, black-soiled delta of Lower Egypt and the long, sun-scorched valley of Upper Egypt. Its capital, Memphis, was a sprawling city of mud brick walls and wooden palaces, a hive of political intrigue where the memory of civil war was still fresh. The world outside Egypt was a tapestry of nascent powers. In Mesopotamia, the Sumerian city-states of Ur and Uruk were reaching their zenith, writing their myths on clay tablets. In the Aegean, the Cycladic islanders carved their stark white idols. Across the vast wilderness of Europe and Asia, humanity lived in scattered tribal settlements. Egypt was a rising power, but its sense of self was still being formed, its identity being written not yet in granite, but in the perishable materials of its riverine home. The very concept of eternity was tied to the rhythms of the Nile. The annual flood brought life-giving silt, but it also washed away the works of man. Death was a passage, but the vessel for that journey was profoundly earthly. For centuries, the tombs of kings and nobles were the mastabas, single-story, rectangular structures of sun-dried mud brick with sloping sides and a flat roof, built to house the deceased's mortal shell and their possessions for the afterlife. They were solid, functional, but ultimately temporary, vulnerable to the very floods that sustained the kingdom. They were monuments to the earth, not the sky. The idea of building in hewn stone on a monumental scale simply did not exist. Stone was used for thresholds, for lintels, for the occasional vessel, but the concept of a mountain of cut limestone was as alien as a vessel that could sail the stars. This was Imhotep's world, a land of mud and reeds, of perishable things, a kingdom whose gods were mighty but whose monuments were humble, a civilization that dreamed of eternity but still built for a single lifetime. It was a world waiting for a mind that could see beyond the horizon of the possible, a genius who could look at a pile of mud bricks and envision a staircase to heaven. Into this world of impermanence, a ghost enters the historical record. The origins of Imhotep are a profound and telling silence, a void in the papyri that makes his subsequent ascent all the more miraculous. He was not born of a pharaoh, nor was he the scion of a great noble family from Thebes or Memphis. The most reliable records, written long after his death, suggest his father was a man named Canifer, a title sometimes translated as head of the king's works, hinting at a family of artisans or architects, but certainly not of the ruling elite. Other traditions claim he was born a commoner in a suburb of Memphis. This very anonymity is the crucible in which his character must have been forged. In a society defined by a rigid divine hierarchy, where one's place was determined by birth, Imhotep's only currency was his mind. He could not rely on lineage, on inherited lands, or on ancestral power. His rise depended solely on the force of his intellect, a genius so self-evident it could not be ignored. This lack of inherited status would have instilled in him a unique perspective. He would have seen the court not from the top down, but from the bottom up. He would have understood the mechanics of power not as an abstract birthright, but as a complex system of alliances, knowledge, and utility. His ancestral curse, if any, was his obscurity. His gift was the untethered ambition that came with it. While nobles might have been content to manage their estates, Imhotep had to prove his worth with every calculation, every piece of advice, every medical diagnosis. This relentless pressure to excel, to be not just good but essential, forged a mind of extraordinary discipline and breathtaking scope. He was driven by a burning need to carve a name for himself, not just in the memory of the court, but into the very fabric of the landscape. He sought a permanence that his humble origins denied him, an immortality that would be built, not inherited. This is the key to his psychology. His entire life's work would become an obsessive, brilliant war against the transient nature of his own existence and the mud-brick world that he was born into. His first step into the great game was likely not with a measuring rod and a blueprint, but with a reed pen and a papyrus scroll. Imhotep's initial ascent in the labyrinthine court of the Third Dynasty's second king, Pharaoh Net-Jereket, known to history as Djoser, was almost certainly as a scribe and a physician. In ancient Egypt, literacy was a form of power, a key that unlocked the highest echelons of the administration and the priesthood. The man who could read, write, and master the complex hieroglyphic script was indispensable. It is believed Imhotep first distinguished himself through his mastery of this sacred craft, perhaps as a temple scribe or a treasury official, where his organizational skills would have become immediately apparent. But it was his secondary expertise that likely brought him to the direct attention of the king: his knowledge of medicine. Before he was the architect of stone, he was an architect of the human body. Ancient texts, such as the Edwin Smith Papyrus, a medical treatise so advanced that it describes anatomical observations and surgical procedures and is widely believed to have been originally authored by Imhotep, reveal a mind that was rational, observational, and deeply analytical. In an age where disease was primarily seen as a magical or divine affliction, Imhotep approached it as a physician, a pragmatic healer. This combination of administrative talent and scientific knowledge made him a unique figure at court. He was not just another priest chanting incantations or another noble jockeying for favor. He was a problem solver, a man of practical wisdom whose counsel was grounded in observation and logic. Djoser, a powerful and ambitious ruler, would have recognized the value of such a mind. The pharaoh was not just a king. He was the living embodiment of the god Horus, the nexus between the divine and mortal realms. His health was the health of the state itself. In Imhotep, Djoser found not only a man who could potentially prolong his life, but also a mind capable of organizing the kingdom with unparalleled efficiency. It was in the quiet shadows of the palace, as a trusted advisor and healer, that Imhotep laid the foundation of his power, earning the king's confidence long before he ever proposed to build him a mountain. Beneath the calm, logical exterior of the physician and the meticulous calculations of the administrator, a deeper, more powerful force drove Imhotep. His true inner motivation was a profound philosophical obsession, the desire to impose eternal mathematical order on the terrifying chaos of the natural world. This was not mere ambition for political power or personal wealth. It was a deeply personal war against the fundamental enemies of Egyptian civilization: decay, death, and the oblivion of time. To understand his mind, one must understand the Egyptian worldview. They saw the universe as a precarious balance, or mayat, constantly threatened by Isfet, the forces of chaos. This chaos was manifest in the unpredictable flooding of the Nile, in the ravages of disease, in the scorching winds of the desert that buried all things, and ultimately in the decomposition of the human body, which threatened the soul's journey in the afterlife. Imhotep's genius was to see this not as a theological problem to be solved with hymns and rituals alone, but as an engineering problem. He saw the decay of the mud-brick mastabas slowly dissolving back into the earth, and understood it as a failure of design. He studied the preservation of the body through mummification and saw a system that could be perfected. His secret motivation was to create a closed, perfect system, a machine for eternity that would be immune to the ravages of time and chaos. The step pyramid was not just to be a tomb, it was to be a fortress against entropy. Its solid stone form a declaration that human ingenuity could create a pocket of perfect order that would last forever. He was driven by a creator's hubris, a belief that through reason, mathematics, and organization, he could design a reality more permanent than the one the gods had provided. This is the source of his revolutionary fire. He sought not merely to serve his king in this life, but to build him an indestructible new reality for the next, and in doing so, to prove that the human mind could architect a victory over mortality itself. The catalyst for Imhotep's revolution was the forging of one of the most consequential partnerships in ancient history: the fateful alliance between the master builder and his dreamer king. Pharaoh Djoser was not a passive monarch. He was a ruler of immense ambition, a king who presided over a period of relative peace and growing prosperity, and who was not content with the modest traditions of his ancestors. He did not just want a tomb. He wanted a statement of power that would echo for eternity, a monument that would elevate his reign above all who had come before. He possessed the vision and, crucially, the willingness to break with centuries of sacred tradition. In his brilliant vizier, Imhotep, Djoser found more than just a competent servant. He found a mind capable of giving form to his most audacious dreams. It was a perfect symbiosis. Djoser provided the royal will, the political authority, and the immense resources of the state, the manpower, the quarries, the food supplies. Imhotep provided the blueprint, the technical genius, the organizational prowess, and the sheer intellectual audacity to attempt what had never been imagined. Their relationship transcended that of a simple king and his minister. It must have been a deep intellectual collaboration, built on years of trust established when Imhotep served as physician and scribe. One can imagine the conversations in the cool halls of the Memphis palace. Djoser speaking of his desire for a tomb that would touch the heavens, a true gateway to the afterlife, and Imhotep, for the first time, sketching not the flat roof of a mastaba, but a stack of them, one on top of the other, reaching ever upward, a ladder to the stars. Djoser had the courage to say yes to a plan that would have seemed like madness to his more conservative priests and nobles. He staked his legacy, his religious authority, and the economy of his kingdom on the vision of one man. Without Djoser's ambition, Imhotep's genius might have been confined to administrative reforms and medical papyri. Without Imhotep's genius, Djoser's ambition would have remained an unfulfilled dream, buried under another mound of dissolving mud brick. Together, they formed a single creative force, a king who dared to dream of eternity and the man who knew how to build it. The decision to build a mountain of stone was not merely an architectural choice. It was a declaration of war on tradition, and a battle Imhotep had to win before the first block was ever quarried. The price of this new form of power was the shattering of sacred norms that had governed the Egyptian afterlife for centuries. His primary opponents were not rival architects, but the powerful and deeply conservative priesthood, particularly the cult of Ra based in Heliopolis. For them, the mastaba was not just a building, it was a sacred form, a symbol of the primordial mound from which all life had emerged. To abandon it was to tamper with the very cosmology of creation. One can envision the tense councils, the air thick with the smoke of incense and priestly indignation. The priests would have argued from scripture and tradition, warning the pharaoh of the divine wrath he risked by embracing such a radical, hubristic design. They would have pointed to the practical impossibilities, the quarrying and transport of hundreds of thousands of tons of limestone, a task never before attempted on such a scale. They would have whispered of the chaos it would unleash, diverting labor and resources from the temples and farms. Imhotep's power in these debates was his appeal directly to the king, armed not with theology, but with logic, with models, with calculations. He had to prove that his vision was not blasphemy, but a more potent form of worship. He likely argued that this new structure, this stairway, was a more effective and literal means for the king's soul, his Ba, to ascend to the circumpolar stars, the realm of the gods. He turned the argument from one of tradition to one of divine efficacy. The first blood shed in this project was not that of a worker, but the symbolic blood of an ancient and revered tradition. Imhotep had to be a politician as much as an architect, persuading a skeptical court and a powerful priesthood that his stairway to heaven was not an act of human arrogance, but the next logical step in the evolution of their king's divinity. He was redesigning not just a tomb, but the very pathway to eternal life. Imhotep's true antagonists were not the jealous priests in the court of Memphis, but a trinity of silent, implacable foes: time, sand, and gravity. His entire architectural endeavor was a meticulously planned war against these fundamental forces of nature that had devoured every human creation before him. Time was the enemy that eroded memory and purpose. His response was to build not with perishable mud brick, but with limestone, a material that held the memory of geological ages, and to have his name carved beside his king's, a defiant act against personal oblivion. The desert sand was the second enemy, a relentless tide that buried and obscured. The sheer verticality of the step pyramid was a counterattack. It was not a low-slung structure that could be easily swallowed by the dunes, but a towering landmark that would command the horizon, a permanent anchor in a shifting landscape. But his most formidable adversary was gravity, the invisible crushing force that pulls all things back to the earth. The flat-roofed mastaba worked with gravity, settling into the ground. Imhotep's design chose to fight it. Every single course of stone, every angled buttress, every subterranean chamber was part of a complex and revolutionary calculation to defy the downward pull. He understood that to build high, he had to build smart. He developed the technique of using smaller, more manageable blocks of stone laid in courses, rather than attempting to raise impossibly large megaliths. He designed the pyramid with a slight incline and inward-leaning courses, transforming the raw downward force of gravity into a source of structural stability, channeling the weight to press inward and hold the structure together. His network of underground tunnels and chambers, extending nearly 6 kilometers, was not just a burial complex. It was also a massive foundation, an anchor rooting his artificial mountain deep into the bedrock. Every element of the Saqqara complex was a strategic move in this great war. He was a general commanding an army of stone, and his genius lay in understanding that to defeat the eternal forces of chaos, you could not simply resist them. You had to understand their laws and turn their own power against them. Even the greatest genius is not immune to the laws of physics, and somewhere in the 30-year-long construction of the pyramid, a moment of profound crisis must have struck. This is the unrecorded scene, the catastrophe of the first stone, a lesson in humility that surely tested the architect and his king. We can imagine a chamber deep beneath the earth, its ceiling supported by massive limestone pillars, when a sound, like the cracking of the world's bones, echoes through the tunnels. A fissure appears in a key support beam. Dust rains down, and the terrible groaning of stone under unbearable stress fills the air, sending workers fleeing in terror. Perhaps a section of the subterranean galleries collapsed, burying tools and plans under tons of rubble. For Imhotep, this would have been more than a technical problem. It would have been a theological crisis. His entire project was predicated on creating a perfect, eternal, and ordered space. A structural failure was a victory for chaos, a sign that perhaps the priests were right, that he had trespassed into a domain reserved for the gods. In that moment of crisis, his relationship with Djoser would have been tested to its limit. Whispers would have spread through the work camps and the court. The project was cursed, the architect a fraud. This was his psychological breaking point, but it was also the moment that forged the engineer from the architect. He understood then that vision alone was not enough. He had to innovate, to learn from his mistakes in real time. He would have descended into the damaged chambers himself, studying the fracture patterns, calculating the load vectors, realizing the limitations of the materials and techniques he was using. This failure forced him to develop new principles of structural support, perhaps inventing the use of engaged columns, columns attached to walls, a feature seen for the first time in his complex, not just as decoration, but as a revolutionary form of reinforcement. The breaking of the stone was what prevented the breaking of the man. It taught him that humility before the forces of nature was a prerequisite for conquering them. The near disaster of a structural failure became the unlikely catalyst for Imhotep's greatest innovation, transforming him from a mere builder into the inventor of a revolutionary new system. Faced with the chaos of a potential collapse and the immense logistical nightmare of managing a workforce the size of a city, he realized he couldn't just rebuild. He had to rethink the entire process from the ground up. This is where his administrative genius, honed during his time as a scribe and vizier, came to the fore. He effectively invented the concept of large-scale project management. He organized the tens of thousands of laborers not as a single amorphous mob, but as a structured, hierarchical army of workers. He created specialized divisions: quarrymen, transport crews, masons, carpenters, and toolmakers, each with its own foreman and supply chains. He established permanent settlements near the construction site, complete with bakeries, breweries, and infirmaries, understanding that a well-fed and cared-for workforce was a more efficient one. He revolutionized logistics, coordinating the quarrying of limestone from Tura on the opposite bank of the Nile and red granite from Aswan, hundreds of miles to the south. This required a fleet of ships, a network of supply depots, and a precise timetable synchronized with the river's annual flood. From the chaos of the cracked stone, he created an unprecedented system of order. He implemented rigorous quality control, ensuring that each of the hundreds of thousands of blocks was cut to precise specifications. This level of standardization was unheard of. He was creating not just a building, but a template for all future monumental constructions in Egypt. The Step Pyramid complex became a massive state enterprise, a machine that consumed resources and manpower on an industrial scale, but which in turn drove innovation in tool-making, mathematics, astronomy for alignments, and bureaucracy. Imhotep used the crisis not just to save his project, but to forge the very administrative and technical tools that would define Egyptian civilization for the next 2.5 millennia. The culmination of 3 decades of relentless effort, political struggle, and intellectual warfare was a moment of supreme triumph. The awakening of the first city of the dead. Imagine the day of its final consecration. The air, for once, is clear of white dust. The roar of construction has been replaced by the solemn chants of priests. Thousands of nobles, officials, and artisans, the entire elite of the kingdom, are gathered on the sands of Saqqara, their colorful linen garments a vibrant river against the pale desert. Before them, the finished complex gleams under the Egyptian sun, a vision of pristine, white limestone. It is not just the 6-stepped pyramid that astonishes them, but the entire 27-acre enclosure, surrounded by a magnificent niched wall over 30 feet high with 15 gateways, of which only one is real. Inside this wall is a microcosm of the royal palace in Memphis, a sprawling complex of dummy buildings, chapels, temples, and courtyards, all carved from solid stone. There is the Hebsed Court, with its dual pavilions representing Upper and Lower Egypt, where the king's soul would eternally perform the ritual of rejuvenation. There are the houses of the North and South, representing the 2 halves of his kingdom. Every detail, from the stone doors carved to look as if they swing on hinges, to the ceilings of chapels carved to resemble wooden logs, is a masterpiece of illusion and permanence. This is a stone kingdom built for a stone king. As Djoser, adorned in gold and lapis lazuli, performs the final rituals, a profound realization must have settled upon the crowd. This was more than a tomb. It was a statement of cosmic power, a permanent stage for the king's eternal life, a machine designed to perpetually channel the forces of the universe to sustain his soul. For the first time, the Egyptians could see the abstract concept of eternity given physical, monumental form. It was a triumph so absolute, so reality-altering, that it would change their civilization forever, setting the standard for every pharaoh who would follow. At the pinnacle of his achievement, standing before the gleaming white city he had willed into existence, Imhotep must have experienced a profound psychological shift. This was his moment of hubris, the instant a creator looks upon his creation and sees in it a reflection of his own power. He would have looked at the step pyramid not just as a loyal servant who had fulfilled his king's command, but as a master who had successfully imposed his intellectual will upon the very fabric of the cosmos. He, a man of humble birth, had designed the landscape of eternity. He had dictated the path his divine king's soul would walk for the next 1,000,000 years. In his mind, the distinction between serving a god and commanding the forces of divinity must have begun to blur. He had quarried mountains, organized an army of men, and bent the laws of physics to his will. What was this, if not a godlike power? The unprecedented honor granted to him by Djoser, the carving of his name and titles on the base of the Pharaoh's statue, was external confirmation of this internal realization. It declared to the world that his contribution was seen as almost equal to the king's. He was no longer just the vizier or the architect. He was the co-creator of this eternal reality. This was the seed of his future divinity, planted not by the prayers of supplicants centuries later, but by his own consciousness in this moment of supreme triumph. He saw that his own Ka, his life force, was now inextricably linked with this immortal stone structure. While the pharaoh's soul would ascend the stairway to the stars, his own legacy, his own name, was now embedded in its foundations. He had achieved a form of immortality that was perhaps even more potent than the king's. Djoser would live on in the afterlife, but he, Imhotep, would live on in the very idea of creation, in the minds of every builder and thinker who would ever look upon his work. While Imhotep battled the forces of nature, he also had to navigate the treacherous currents of human envy. His most potent sworn enemy was likely not a single man, but the embodiment of the old, established order, the high priest of Ra at Heliopolis. We can imagine this man, a figure of immense power and ancient lineage, watching the rise of the upstart vizier with a mixture of awe and venomous jealousy. Let us call him Ankh-F-N-Ra. For generations, his family had been the primary interpreters of divine will, the guardians of the sacred traditions that governed the king's relationship with the gods. Their power stemmed from their monopoly on cosmology. Then came Imhotep, a man with no priestly lineage, who whispered new ideas into the pharaoh's ear. Ideas that did not come from the ancient papyri in the temple archives, but from his own brilliant, calculating mind. Ankh-F-N-Ra would have seen the step pyramid not as a monument to Djoser, but as a monument to Imhotep's ego. He would have seen the diversion of state resources, gold, labor, food, away from the temples and into this colossal personal project as a direct attack on his authority. Their conflict was the classic struggle between established faith and revolutionary science. In the temple courts, Ankh-F-N-Ra would have used theology as his weapon, warning that this artificial mountain was an act of supreme hubris that would anger the gods and disrupt Mahat. He would have spread rumors among the nobility that Imhotep was a sorcerer, using strange arts to bewitch the king. Imhotep, in turn, fought back with results. Every successfully laid course of stone, every perfectly aligned corridor, was a testament to the power of his reason and a refutation of the priest's dire warnings. Theirs was a personal drama played out against a backdrop of cosmic significance. A clash between the man who claimed to know the will of the gods through ancient texts and the man who was actively reshaping the divine landscape with his own two hands. Ankh-F-N-Ra saw a mortal dangerously blurring the lines, unaware that history would not just blur those lines, but erase them completely. Imhotep's genius was not confined to a single stone mountain. He was the architect of an entire civilization's operating system. While the step pyramid was his most visible legacy, his work in reforming the administration and foundations of knowledge in Egypt was arguably even more profound and lasting. As Djoser's vizier, he was the brain of the state, and he redesigned its bureaucracy with the same logical precision he applied to architecture. He centralized the national administration in Memphis, creating new departments and refining the system of tax collection based on a national census of land and livestock that he likely initiated. This created a surplus of wealth and grain that made massive public works, like the pyramid, possible. He understood that a great state required not just a great king, but a great system. Yet his most remarkable contribution beyond stone was in the field of medicine. He is widely considered the true author of the text that became the Edwin Smith Papyrus, the oldest known surgical document in history. This text is revolutionary because it is almost completely devoid of magical thinking. It describes 48 cases of trauma, from skull fractures to spinal injuries, in a systematic format. Title, Examination, Diagnosis, and Treatment. It contains detailed anatomical observations and demonstrates a level of medical knowledge that would not be surpassed for more than 2,000 years. This papyrus reveals the core of Imhotep's mind: rational, empirical, and observational. He was a man who sought practical solutions to real-world problems, whether it was a broken bone or a collapsing tunnel. Furthermore, as a patron of scribal arts, he is associated with the birth of wisdom literature, texts that offered practical and ethical advice. In every field he touched, he replaced disorganized tradition with logical systems. He was building more than a tomb for one king. He was laying the foundations of law, medicine, and administration that would allow the kingdom of Egypt itself to endure for millennia. The sheer breadth of Imhotep's influence is captured in the staggering array of his official titles, a list that reads less like a curriculum vitae and more like the description of a committee. He was the Chancellor of the King of Lower Egypt, placing him at the apex of the secular government. He was the first after the King of Upper Egypt, his counterpart in the Southern Kingdom. He was the administrator of the Great Palace, effectively the king's chief of staff. As a hereditary nobleman, he was granted a status that his birth did not provide, a clear sign of the pharaoh's extreme favor. And in a move that must have infuriated the established clergy, he was made high priest of Heliopolis, the paramount center of the sun cult of Ra, giving him supreme authority over the very priests who may have initially opposed him. This combination of the highest secular and religious power in one person, a person of non-royal blood, was utterly unprecedented. Yet behind this glittering facade of public honors lies a complete and total void. We know nothing of Imhotep the man. There is no record of a wife, of children, of friends, or personal rivalries beyond what can be inferred. The man who documented everything from state granaries to spinal fractures left no personal trace. This silence is profoundly revealing. It suggests a life of singular, obsessive focus, a man entirely consumed by his work. His personal life was his public works. His children were his architectural innovations and his medical texts. He seems to have been married not to a person, but to the abstract concepts of order, legacy, and permanence. This vacuum of personal detail makes him a perfect vessel for later legends. With no family to ground him in the messy reality of human affairs, he could more easily be transformed into a pure symbol of wisdom and creative power. He existed as a collection of titles and achievements, a disembodied intellect whose only traces were the monumental changes he wrought upon the world, making his eventual transition from man to myth all the more seamless. For 30 years, the alliance between Imhotep and Djoser had seemed as solid and eternal as the stone they were quarrying. But the architect of eternity was about to confront the one force he could not engineer his way around: the mortality of his patron. As Djoser aged, the first cracks began to appear in Imhotep's meticulously constructed world. The pharaoh's declining health would have sent tremors of anxiety through the court. Imhotep's power, his unprecedented authority, and the very continuation of his revolutionary projects were not institutionalized. They were entirely dependent on the personal favor and the living presence of one man. His rivals, the old nobility and the conservative priesthood whom he had sidelined, would have been watching and waiting, sharpening their knives in the shadows. They would see Djoser's impending death not as a national tragedy, but as an opportunity to restore the old order and purge the court of this commoner's radical influence. Imhotep, the ultimate planner, surely foresaw this. He must have felt a growing desperation, a sense that time was running out. His work was not just about ensuring Djoser's afterlife, but also about cementing his own legacy and protecting his innovations from being dismantled after the king was gone. The frenetic pace of construction at Saqqara in its later years might be evidence of this race against time. He knew that if the king died before the complex was finished, before its theological and architectural power was fully established, it might be abandoned by a successor with different priorities. The shadow of the king's mortality cast a long, dark pall over the gleaming white limestone of the pyramid. Imhotep had designed a perfect vessel for his king's eternal soul, but he now faced the terrifying possibility that the entire system would be switched off before it could ever be activated. Faced with the impending death of his patron and the fragility of his own position, Imhotep made a fateful strategic move. He shifted his focus from building with stone to building with knowledge. Understanding that even the greatest monument can fall into ruin or be usurped by a later king, he undertook a project to ensure that his most valuable creation, his ideas, would become immortal. This was the moment he decided to systematically codify his revolutionary wisdom, to carve it not into limestone, but into the incorruptible medium of the written word. He likely gathered the finest scribes in the kingdom, establishing what might be considered the first true research institute, and began the immense task of dictating and compiling his life's work. He oversaw the creation of what would become the foundational texts of Egyptian civilization. In medicine, he transformed oral traditions of healing and magical spells into the rational, observational case studies of the Edwin Smith Papyrus, creating a textbook for generations of physicians. In architecture, he surely documented the mathematical principles, the engineering techniques, and the logistical systems he had invented to build the step pyramid, creating a blueprint that would be followed and refined by the builders of the Great Pyramids at Giza. In governance, he refined the legal codes and administrative procedures that had made the state so efficient. And in philosophy, he contributed to the wisdom literature, texts that offered a pragmatic guide to living a just and effective life, ensuring that his ethical framework would endure. This was his ultimate act of defiance against chaos. He was transforming his personal, experiential knowledge into a permanent, transmissible legacy. He was betting that an idea, once written down, was harder to kill than a king and more durable than a stone. It was a gamble to secure his own form of eternity, ensuring that even if his enemies erased his name from the court records, his mind would continue to shape Egypt long after he and his king had turned to dust. The moment Imhotep had long dreaded finally arrived. The death of the god-king, Djoser, was not just a political event, it was a cosmic one, and for Imhotep, a personal catastrophe. Imagine the scene: the royal bedchamber in the palace at Memphis, thick with the scent of sacred oils and the sound of hushed prayers. The living Horus, the center of the Egyptian universe, lies still. For the nation, it is a moment of profound uncertainty and grief. But for Imhotep, it is the closing of an era. The man who had been his champion, his collaborator, and his shield for more than 3 decades was gone. The funeral itself would have been the grandest spectacle Egypt had ever seen, the culmination of Imhotep's life's work. A solemn procession would have carried the king's mummified body across the Nile to the necropolis at Saqqara. The priests, including Imhotep himself in his role as high priest, would have performed the opening of the mouth ceremony, magically restoring the senses to the deceased king for his life in the hereafter. Finally, They would have carried the royal sarcophagus deep into the labyrinth of tunnels beneath the pyramid and sealed it in the granite burial chamber. As the final stone block was slid into place, sealing the tomb for eternity, it must have felt to Imhotep like the closing of a door on his own life. The great engine of eternity he had built had now been activated, and in the process, sealed shut. He was now alone, a man of immense prestige but without his primary source of power, facing a court of rivals and a new, unknown pharaoh. The completion of his masterpiece and the death of its occupant were inextricably linked, a moment of ultimate triumph and profound personal loss, leaving him a lonely giant in a world he had single-handedly remade. After the sealing of Djoser's tomb, Imhotep did not simply vanish. The historical record, though scant, indicates that he went on to serve at least 3 more pharaohs of the Third Dynasty: Sekhemkhet, Kaaba, and possibly Huni. He retained his titles and his immense prestige. Indeed, Sekhemkhet even began construction of his own step pyramid at Saqqara, a project clearly designed by Imhotep that was intended to be even larger and more elaborate than Djoser's. But the project was abandoned after only the lowest tiers were completed, likely due to the king's short reign. This unfinished pyramid stands as a silent monument to the changing reality. The revolutionary fire was gone. The perfect symbiosis between a visionary king and a genius architect had been a unique alignment of the stars, and it could not be replicated. Imhotep transitioned from being the driving force of the kingdom to becoming its elder statesman. He was no longer the radical innovator, but the revered guardian of wisdom. His role likely became more advisory, his presence a living link to a glorious past. He became a figure of legend even within his own lifetime. Younger scribes and architects would have sought his counsel, listening in awe to the man who had personally designed a stairway to the stars. This period was not a collapse into disgrace, but a slow, dignified fade from the center of power into the realm of myth. His name became synonymous with supreme wisdom, healing, and creative power. He was no longer just a man who knew how to build things. He was the man who knew everything. This gradual transformation was crucial for his later deification. By retreating from the messy, day-to-day politics of the court, his image became purified, polished, and elevated, making it easier for future generations to forget the man of calculation and ambition and remember only the icon of divine intellect. The final act in the life of the world's first architect is his most profound mystery. Imhotep, the man who designed the most spectacular and enduring tomb in history for his king, vanished from the world without leaving a tomb of his own. Despite decades of searching by archaeologists, his final resting place has never been found. This absence is the ultimate and most beautiful irony of his story. Did he design a secret, hidden tomb for himself, so cleverly concealed that it has eluded discovery for 4.5 millennia? Or did he, in a final act of humility or perhaps supreme confidence, choose to have no great monument at all, content that his legacy was not a pile of stones, but the knowledge he had bequeathed to his civilization? One can imagine his final days, an old man, his mind still sharp but his body failing, looking out over the desert landscape that he had forever changed. He had conquered gravity and time. He had codified medicine and law. He had served 4 pharaohs. He had seen his great vision for Sekhemkhet's pyramid abandoned, a stark reminder that even the grandest plans are subject to the whims of mortality. His death, when it came, was quiet. There were no grand state funerals recorded on temple walls, no cult established immediately in his honor. He simply disappeared, leaving behind a name whispered with reverence and a mountain of stone that pointed to the sky. This lack of a tomb was essential for his eventual godhood. A known tomb would have anchored him to the earth, making him a specific, historical, and very dead man. By vanishing, he remained unbound, a free-floating spirit, a pure concept of wisdom. He did not need a tomb because his entire country had become his monument. The man who taught Egypt how to build for eternity had achieved a different kind of permanence, dissolving not into dust, but into the very memory of his people. The legacy of Imhotep underwent a fascinating and dramatic evolution, a two-stage process of remembrance and reinvention that spanned millennia. For the first 1,000 years after his death, during the Old, Middle, and New Kingdoms, he was remembered and revered as a historical figure of immense genius. Scribes of the New Kingdom, sitting down to write, would often pour out a small libation from their water pots in honor of Imhotep, paying homage to him as the patron saint of their craft. He was seen as the archetypal wise man, a model vizier, a master builder, and a great physician. He was a human hero, a peak of mortal achievement to be emulated, but he was not yet a god. Then, around the 7th century BCE, during the late period, a profound transformation began. Egypt was in a state of decline, a proud and ancient civilization suffering from internal strife and the humiliation of foreign invasion by Libyans, Nubians, and Persians. In this climate of cultural anxiety, the Egyptians began to look back with intense nostalgia to the glories of their past, particularly to the Old Kingdom, the age of the pyramid builders. They needed heroes, and Imhotep was the perfect candidate. His story was rediscovered and retold, his achievements magnified into the realm of the supernatural. His medical prowess was no longer seen as the result of scientific observation, but as evidence of divine healing power. Slowly, shrines began to be dedicated to him near his great pyramid at Saqqara. He was becoming more than a man. The conflict of interpretations was between Imhotep, the historical sage, and Imhotep, the emerging savior. And as Egypt's troubles deepened, the need for a savior won out. He was being retrofitted for a new purpose, his memory resurrected and reshaped to serve the spiritual needs of a nation in crisis. Here, at last, we find the solution to the central paradox. How did a mortal man become a god? The deification of Imhotep was not a single event, but a slow, 2,000-year process fueled by a combination of his own undeniable genius and the evolving needs of a civilization. His historical achievements were the seed. His innovations in architecture, medicine, and administration were so profound, so foundational, that they already seemed superhuman to later generations. He was the man who had done the impossible. But the seed needed the right soil in which to grow, and that soil was the cultural crisis of late-period Egypt. As the nation struggled under foreign domination, its people yearned for a homegrown hero, a source of national pride and supernatural aid. Furthermore, a new cultural influence was entering Egypt: the Greeks. The Greeks brought with them their own traditions, including the concept of deifying mortals who had displayed extraordinary abilities, such as Heracles, or the legendary healer Asclepius. Greek settlers and merchants in Egypt, hearing the stories of the ancient, wise physician Imhotep, saw a natural parallel to their own god of medicine, Asclepius. They began to worship him in tandem, a process known as syncretism. This Greco-Egyptian fusion supercharged Imhotep's nascent cult. The Egyptians, seeing the Greeks honor one of their own historical figures as a god, fully embraced his divinity. Temples were built, most famously the Asclepieion at Saqqara, a sanatorium where the sick would come to be healed in their dreams by the spirit of the deified Imhotep. So the paradox is solved. He became a god because his life's work was so brilliant it bordered on the divine. And 2 millennia later, his country found itself in a desperate situation, culturally porous enough to be influenced by Greek ideas, and in profound need of a homegrown god of healing and hope. His godhood was not a recognition granted by his contemporaries, but a promotion granted by his distant descendants. The verdict of history on Imhotep is a profound lesson on the nature of legacy and the power of a story. His life teaches us that the path to immortality is not always forged through conquest or royal lineage. He demonstrates that a legacy built on knowledge, innovation, and service to civilization can ultimately prove more enduring than one built on military power. The great warrior pharaohs of the New Kingdom, like Ramesses the Great, covered Egypt in monuments to their own battlefield victories, yet none of them were ever deified in the same way as the peaceful vizier from the Old Kingdom. Imhotep's story is a testament to the universal human need for figures of wisdom and healing. While gods of war and power may dominate in times of strength, gods of healing and hope become essential in times of suffering. His ascension reveals that godhood is not merely a status conferred by birth, but a role that can be retrospectively assigned by a culture to a figure whose life's work becomes so fundamental, so necessary, that it transcends the boundaries of historical memory and becomes a living myth. He is the ultimate proof that a civilization's soul is not only preserved in its fortresses and palaces, but in its libraries, its hospitals, and its engineering blueprints. The universal lesson of his life is that humanity's greatest heroes are not always those who conquer the world, but those who build it, heal it, and understand it. His saga is the archetypal story of the gifted commoner who rises to change the world, a narrative so powerful that it compelled a civilization to break its own most sacred rule and elevate a man of flesh and blood to a seat among the eternal gods. The final frame is the Saqqara necropolis at twilight. The sky is a deep, bruised purple, and the last rays of the sun paint the western face of the step pyramid in hues of orange and rose. The wind whispers across the sand, a low, timeless sound that carries the dust of millennia. A lone visitor stands looking at the monument, a stark, geometric silhouette against the dying light. The stones before them are real, a tangible testament to the genius of an architect, the man of mathematics and logistics, who organized a nation to raise a mountain. They can almost feel the weight of those 2.5 million tons of limestone, a monument to a king's ambition and a vizier's intellect. But as the first stars begin to appear in the darkening sky, another story echoes on that same wind. It is the story of the pilgrims who came to this very spot 2,000 years later, the lame, the blind, the sick, who did not see a tomb, but a place of hope. They whispered a different name in their prayers, not Djoser, the king, but Imhotep, the healer, the god. The pyramid he built was a staircase for a pharaoh's soul, an incredible but ultimately failed attempt to conquer death. But the story he left behind, the memory of his wisdom, became a staircase for the hopes of millions. His stones reached for the heavens, but his name, carried on the breath of supplicants, reached even higher, achieving a true and lasting immortality that the pharaohs in their granite sarcophagi could only ever dream of.